What happens when one of country music's most respected artists comes face to face with a talk show host who refuses to back down from controversial questions? Tonight, we're diving deep into the explosive confrontation that had Chris Stapleton walking off the Jimmy Kimmel live set, leaving millions of viewers stunned and the internet buzzing for weeks. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in tension that built moment by moment until it reached a breaking point that nobody saw coming. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think really caused this whole situation to explode the way it did. The tension in Studio 6A was palpable from the moment Chris Stapleton settled into the guest chair across from Jimmy Kimmel. What started as routine pre-show banter had already taken an uncomfortable turn during the commercial break. And now, with cameras rolling live to millions of households across America, both men seemed determined to make their points heard. "So, Chris, welcome back to the show," Jimmy began, his trademark grin feeling slightly forced as he shuffled his index cards. "I have to say, your new album has been getting incredible reviews, but there's been some interesting commentary about your recent statements regarding the music industry." Chris shifted slightly in his chair, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Jimmy's face. "Well, Jimmy, I've always been pretty straightforward about my feelings on how the business side of things has changed over the years. Music used to be about the song, about the story you're trying to tell." Right. Jimmy nodded. But there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't quite ready to let this remain a comfortable conversation. "But when you say the industry has lost its way, some people are interpreting that as you taking shots at other artists who maybe approach their careers differently than you do." The studio audience sensed the shift immediately. What had started as warm applause was now replaced by an almost electric silence, the kind that happens when people realize they're witnessing something unexpected unfold in real time. Chris leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Jimmy, I think there's a difference between taking shots at people and simply stating what you believe in. I've never mentioned specific names, never called anyone out directly. I talk about music, about authenticity, about what I think makes a great song great." "But come on," Jimmy pressed, his media-trained smile starting to fade around the edges. "When you're talking about authenticity in country music, everyone knows you're referring to the pop country crossover artists, the ones who are dominating the charts right now. Isn't that a little bit like throwing stones from a glass house?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Chris's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment, the only sound in the studio was the barely audible hum of the cameras and lights. "A glass house," Chris repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register that anyone familiar with his music would recognize as dangerous territory. "Jimmy, I've been writing and performing music for over 20 years. I've written songs for artists across every genre. I've played dive bars and sold out arenas, and I've never once compromised what I believe makes music worth listening to." Jimmy sensed he had struck a nerve, and rather than backing away, he seemed to double down. "I'm not questioning your credentials, Chris, but let's be honest here. You've built a pretty significant part of your brand on being the guy who keeps it real, the authentic voice in a sea of manufactured pop country. That's a pretty convenient position to take when you're already successful." The audience was now completely silent, and even the production crew seemed to have stopped their usual behind-the-scenes movement. This was no longer a typical late-night interview. This was something else entirely. Chris sat back in his chair, his hands clasped together in front of him. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. "Convenient," he said, the word coming out like he was tasting something bitter. "Jimmy, there's nothing convenient about standing up for what you believe in when it means turning down opportunities, when it means saying no to people who want to change your sound, when it means watching other people take shortcuts while you stick to your principles." "But that's exactly my point," Jimmy interrupted, his own voice gaining momentum. "You act like you're the guardian of some sacred tradition, but music evolves, Chris. It changes. And maybe, just maybe, the artists you seem to have such a problem with are just adapting to what audiences actually want to hear." The words hit Chris like a physical blow, and for the first time since the interview began, his carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. His eyes narrowed, and when he leaned forward this time, there was no mistaking the fire building behind his usually measured demeanor. "What audiences want to hear," he repeated slowly. "Or what record labels want to sell them?" Jimmy's smile had completely disappeared, now replaced by something that looked more like a challenge than the usual late-night host charm. That's a pretty cynical way to look at it, Chris. You're basically saying that millions of people who buy these records, who stream these songs, who sing along at concerts, that they're all just being manipulated. I'm saying that when you focus group a song to death, when you write by committee, when you're more concerned about fitting a radio format than telling a truth, then yeah, I think something gets lost, Chris replied, his voice steady but unmistakably heated. And I think people can feel that difference, even if they can't always put their finger on what it is. The studio audience was shifting uncomfortably now. This wasn't the playful banter they had expected from a country music star's appearance on a comedy show. This was raw, unfiltered disagreement playing out in real time, and everyone could sense that neither man was willing to back down. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. Okay, so let me ask you this then. If authenticity is so important to you, how do you explain the fact that your biggest hits, the songs that really put you on the map, were written years before you recorded them? Isn't there something a little calculated about holding on to songs until the perfect moment to release them? Chris's hands, which had been resting calmly on the arms of his chair, suddenly clenched into fists. The question had clearly crossed a line, and the change in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable, calculated. Chris's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than if he had been shouting. Jimmy, those songs were written from places of pain, from experiences that shaped who I am as a person. The reason I held on to them wasn't calculation. It was because they meant too much to me to just throw them away on the wrong project. But you did wait, Jimmy pressed, seemingly oblivious to or unconcerned by the warning signs that Chris was reaching his breaking point. You waited until you had your solo deal, until the timing was right for your career. That sounds pretty strategic to me. The silence that followed was deafening. Chris stared at Jimmy with an intensity that made several people in the front row of the audience visibly uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his words came out measured and deliberate, like he was choosing each one carefully. You want to talk about strategy, Jimmy? Let's talk about strategy. Let's talk about how you book guests on this show specifically to create moments like this, to get clips that will go viral, to generate controversy that keeps people talking about your program. Jimmy's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure. That's a pretty serious accusation. Chris, are you saying I brought you on here just to ambush you? I'm saying that you've spent the last 10 minutes trying to get me to say something inflammatory about other artists, and when I wouldn't take the bait, you decided to attack my integrity directly, Chris replied, his voice gaining strength and conviction with each word. You want authentic? This is what authentic looks like. This is what happens when someone refuses to play your game. The production team behind the cameras was in crisis mode now. Producers were whispering frantically into their headsets, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that was spiraling beyond their control. The show was broadcasting live, and there was no way to edit out what was happening. Jimmy seemed to realize that he had pushed too far, but rather than backing down, he doubled down once again. Look, Chris, I think you're taking this way too personally. This is just a conversation. This is what talk shows are supposed to be about. We ask questions. We discuss things. We try to get to the truth. The truth, Chris laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. The truth is that you invited me here under the pretense of promoting my music. And instead, you spent the entire time trying to make me look like some kind of elitist who looks down on other artists. The truth is that you're more interested in creating drama than actually talking about music. I think you're being a little dramatic here, Jimmy said, his tone taking on a condescending quality that was like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. This is television, Chris. This is entertainment. People tune in to see interesting conversations, not just softball questions about your latest single. Chris stood up slowly, his chair making a small scraping sound against the studio floor that seemed to echo through the unnaturally quiet space. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had just shifted. Entertainment, Chris repeated, standing now at his full height and looking down at Jimmy, who remained seated behind his desk. So my music, my career, my principles, those are all just entertainment to you? They're just content for your show. Jimmy's confidence seemed to waver for the first time since the interview began. Chris, come on, sit back down. Let's talk about this like adults. We are talking about this like adults, Chris replied, his voice now carrying the full weight of his anger and disappointment. Adults don't ambush their guests. Adults don't try to manipulate people into saying things they'll regret later. Adults show respect for the people they invite into their space. The camera operators were getting signals from their directors, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut away. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them pulling out their phones to record what they were witnessing. This was television history in the making, the kind of moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Jimmy finally stood up as well, perhaps realizing that the power dynamic had completely shifted with Chris towering over him from across the desk. Okay, let's just take a step back here. I think we're both getting a little heated, and maybe we should just reset this whole conversation. Reset. Chris's voice carried a bitter edge that cut through the studio like a knife. Jimmy, you can't just reset when things don't go the way you planned. You can't just rewind and pretend like the last 15 minutes didn't happen. This isn't a rehearsal. This isn't a bit. This is real life. The desperation in Jimmy's voice was becoming more apparent with each exchange. Chris, look, I understand you're upset, but we're live on television right now. We've got millions of people watching. Maybe we should just move on to talking about your tour, about your new album. Now you want to talk about my music. Chris shook his head in disbelief. After spending this entire interview trying to tear down everything I stand for, now you want to pivot to the safe questions. Now you want to play it straight. Jimmy's hands were visibly shaking slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. I wasn't trying to tear down anything, Chris. I was asking legitimate questions about your public statements. That's what journalists do. That's what interviewers do. Journalists. Chris's laugh was sharp and humorless. Jimmy, you're a comedian who hosts a talk show. You're not Bob Woodward. You're not conducting some kind of investigative piece. You invited me here to promote my album, and instead you decided to turn it into an ambush interview because you thought it would make good television. The studio crew was in full panic mode now. The director was making frantic hand signals, trying to figure out if they should cut to commercial, but the confrontation was happening too fast and too unpredictably to find a natural break point. I think you're completely miss. What happened here? Jimmy said, his voice rising slightly as he tried to reassert some authority in the situation. I asked you about statements you made publicly. Statements that were reported in major publications. If you didn't want to discuss them, you shouldn't have made them in the first place. That was the final straw. Chris's composure, which had been hanging by a thread for the last several minutes, finally snapped completely. You want to know what I think, Jimmy? I think you're exactly what's wrong with this whole industry. You don't care about music. You don't care about art. You don't care about the people who dedicate their lives to creating something meaningful. All you care about is getting your viral moment, getting your clip that people will share on social media. That's not fair and you know it, Jimmy shot back, his own anger finally breaking through his practiced television persona. I've had hundreds of musicians on this show, and I've always treated them with respect. I've promoted countless albums. I've helped launch careers. Just because I ask a tough question doesn't mean I don't respect what you do. Respect. Chris's voice was incredulous. You call this respect? You bring me on your show. You pretend like you want to have a conversation about music, and then you spend the entire time trying to get me to throw other artists under the bus so you can have your gotcha moment. That's not respect, Jimmy. That's exploitation. The audience was completely silent now, many of them looking back and forth between the two men like they were watching a tennis match. Except the stakes felt much higher than any sporting event. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was personal. Jimmy's face was flushed red now, his carefully maintained composure completely gone. You know what, Chris? Maybe the problem isn't with everyone else. Maybe the problem is that you're so stuck in your own self-righteous bubble that you can't handle anyone questioning your precious principles. Maybe the reason you're so defensive is because, there's some truth to what I'm saying. The words hung in the air like a challenge. And for a moment, it seemed like Chris might actually launch himself across the desk. Instead, he took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was deadly calm. You want to know the truth, Jimmy? The truth is that I came here tonight because I thought we could have a real conversation about music, about songwriting, about the things that mattered to me as an artist. Instead, I found out that you're just another person in this business who's more interested in creating conflict than understanding art. Chris began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. The truth is that you're exactly the kind of person who's turned this industry into what it's become, a place where controversy matters more than creativity, where getting attention is more important than making music that means something. Jimmy watched in horror as Chris unclipped the small microphone from his shirt. Chris, don't do this. We can work this out. We can finish the interview properly. Your fans are watching. Your label is watching. Think about what you're doing here. Chris looked directly into the camera for the first time since the confrontation began, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disappointment. My fans know who I am. They know what I stand for. And they know that I've never backed down from speaking my truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs me something. He handed the microphone to a stunned production assistant who had approached the interview area. Jimmy, I hope you get the viral moment you were looking for. I hope it was worth it. Jimmy stood frozen behind his desk, watching as Chris turned his back and began walking toward the exit. The reality of what was happening seemed to hit him all at once, and desperation crept into his voice as he called out across the studio. Chris, wait. Please don't leave like this. We're still live. We've got 8 more minutes left in the show. Your publicist is going to kill both of us if you walk off right now. Chris paused at the edge of the interview area, his hand resting on the back of one of the guest chairs. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually turn around, like he might give Jimmy one last chance to salvage the situation. But when he spoke, his voice carried a finality that made it clear his decision was already made. My publicist didn't ask me to compromise my principles, Jimmy. She asked me to come on your show and talk about my music. I tried to do that, and you turned it into something else entirely. The band members who had been sitting quietly in their section throughout the entire confrontation exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was unprecedented territory for the show, and no one seemed to know what the protocol was for a guest walking off during a live broadcast. Jimmy's voice became almost pleading as he made one final attempt to keep Chris from leaving. Look, I admit maybe I pushed a little too hard with some of those questions. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here, but we can fix this. We can turn this around. Just come back and sit down and we'll start fresh. Chris turned around one final time, and the look on his face was one of complete disappointment rather than anger. It was somehow more devastating than if he had been shouting. Jimmy, this isn't something you can just fix with a do-ov. This isn't a joke that didn't land or a bit that went too long. You showed me tonight exactly who you are and what you think of people like me. You can't take that back. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the unprecedented scene. The director was frantically trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let the drama play out. But the confrontation was happening too quickly for any coordinated response. I think you're making a huge mistake here, Jimmy said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge as his desperation turned to frustration. You're going to look like the bad guy in this situation. People are going to say you couldn't handle a few tough questions, that you ran away when things got challenging. Chris smiled for the first time since the interview began, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had just heard exactly what they expected to hear. There it is, he said quietly, but his voice carried clearly through the studio's sound system. There's the real Jimmy Kimmel, not the concerned host trying to salvage the interview, not the guy who just wants to have a conversation about music. There's the person who thinks that threatening someone's reputation is the way to keep them in line. The studio audience was completely transfixed now. Many of them had their phones out recording what they were witnessing, understanding instinctively that they were watching something that would be talked about for years to come. Jimmy's face went through a series of expressions as he realized that his final gambit had backfired spectacularly. That's not what I meant, Chris. I'm not threatening anything. I'm just saying that from a public relations standpoint. From a public relations standpoint, Chris interrupted. I'd rather be known as someone who walked away from a situation where I was being disrespected than someone who sat there and took it just to avoid making waves. He began walking again, his stride confident and purposeful. With each step toward the exit, the reality of what was happening became more undeniable. Chris Stapleton, one of the biggest names in country music, was actually walking off Jimmy Kimmel Live during a live broadcast. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy said, turning toward the cameras with a shell-shocked expression. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back... No, Chris called out from near the studio exit, his voice carrying across the entire space. Don't do that. Don't pretend like this is just a normal commercial break. Tell them what really happened here tonight. The entire studio held its breath as Chris delivered his final words before disappearing through the exit. Tell them that sometimes when someone shows you who they really are, the most honest thing you can do is believe them. And with that, Chris Stapleton walked out of Studio 6A, leaving behind a stunned host, a speechless audience, and millions of viewers who had just witnessed one of the most dramatic moments in late-night television history. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Jimmy's bewildered expression as he tried to process what had just happened before finally cutting to commercial. The confrontation between Chris Stapleton and Jimmy Kimmel wasn't just a clash between two entertainers. It was a moment that revealed something deeper about authenticity, respect, and what happens when immovable principles meet unstoppable ambition. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply refusing to participate in something that goes against everything you believe in. What did you think about Chris Stapleton's decision to walk off the show? Was he right to stand up for his principles? Or should he have found a way to finish the interview professionally? Drop a comment below and let us know where you stand on this incredible confrontation. And make sure to subscribe for more stories about the moments when the entertainment world's biggest personalities clash behind the scenes.